Welcome to Avon Talks, the podcast where we explore the people, places, and stories that have shaped the town of Avon, Connecticut. I'm your host, Jim Pabich. Today we're going to step back in time to discover what life was like during Avon's earliest days. My guest is local historian and author Scott Lewis, whose new book, Visionaries and Victims, takes readers through the town's first century, a period filled with a mix of ambition, hardship, and transformation. Scott's stories bring to life the local families who laid the foundation for the town we know today and national figures who crossed their paths. We'll talk about what inspired him to write the history, the surprising discoveries he made along the way, and why understanding Avon's past helps us appreciate the community we live in now. Settle in and join us as we uncover the fascinating stories of Avon's beginnings. Well, welcome, Scott Lewis, to the Avon Talks podcast. Tell us a bit about your background, as it's a bit unusual for an author. Who inspired you to be a writer?
Well, I'd say the person that inspired me to be a writer was my dad, who I dedicated the book to, my late father. My background is such that professionally, I was in accounting and finance for my whole career. I started off in public accounting for 13 years and then worked at the Hartford in finance for 24 years, including the last 10 as controller and chief accounting officer of the Hartford. But in terms of writing, I really owe much of that desire and love of the art to my father, who was in corporate communications at the Aetna in his career. And I know he always wanted to write a book, but when he retired, for one reason or another, he ended up not achieving that. So this is kind of to honor him.
Follow through of a family vision.
Yes, that's right.
That's something. What inspired you to write this book?
So the story of that is interesting. I do volunteer work for the Avon Land Trust. I am the Land Trust treasurer, but I'm also its quote-unquote trail master. And as such, I spent a lot of time building and maintaining hiking trails, much of that on Avon Mountain. So there are a couple of trails. There are two trailheads, one on Nodway and another on Hazen Drive, that lead up to the Hubeline Tower. So I spent so much time up there. One day in 2023, I was thinking to myself, gee, I wonder, this land must have a history to it. I wonder, who lived here? I mean, it's this forest land now. So as I looked into it and did some research, I learned that, in fact, the Hubeline Tower was not the first tower on the mountain. In fact, there were 3 towers prior to that, and those were all in Avon, not in Simsbury.
And there's an entire section in the book.
There's an entire section of my book about the stories of the people who built the Avon Towers. So that led me to give a presentation, first at the Avon Senior Center, then at the Avon Library in the fall of 2023 with what I found. And it was very well received, and soon after that, a lot of other people in town came up to me and asked me, well, gee, can you research my section of town? For example, Huckleberry Hill or Cider Brook. So I thought, well, maybe I'd be interested in doing that. And as I thought about it, well, gee, if I'm going to do all that work, I might as well write a book. And then a couple seconds later, I thought to myself, I think that actually sounds like that would be interesting to me. So that's how I got started on it. And I started in January of 2024. And I finished about a year later after that and submitted the manuscript to a publisher.
So you work pretty rapidly. Let me ask you, because one thing that after reading this book, I wondered about, these days people Google things and that's their primary source. And something like, say we were talking about the towers, which when somebody reads this book, there's some fascinating stories about the towers. How did you approach the sources for that? I mean, where did you find them? Or were they obvious, or did they require some digging?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And to your first point there, I kind of wonder in the future, will AI be writing all of our books, right?
Well, let's hope not.
Let's hope not. That, of course, depends on how much information is available digitally. And while some is, you need to be very careful with those sources. So to start the research on the town of Avon history, a great place to start is the local history room, the Marion Hunter local history room at the Avon Free Public Library. And really, when you think about history is, of course, recorded past events. In order to be able to write about history, somebody along the way had to save letters, diaries, other documents that historians like myself can then draw on to do the research. So I started with the library. From there, I was able to do, some online research. There's, for example, the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History has information available both in person when you go there, such as old letters written from the era, but also they have online. They have digital information as well. But this book took me to a number of different libraries and archives. So the Sterling Library at Yale University, the Houghton Library at Harvard, as well as that Connecticut Museum of Culture and History, and others. But those were the principal ones.
Quite a bit of due diligence on your own part, then. It certainly doesn't sound like it came easy.
Yeah, it for me, it's fun. My nature is detail oriented, so I don't mind digging and sifting through lots of information. And sometimes you just find a couple nuggets. You could spend hours and hours and not find too much of value. But making the connections is real fun. You find one piece of information, you go, oh, I remember him or her from this other information I researched. Let me go check that out, see if there's a connection to my part. And sure enough, there would be often. So that was the fun part of it. And from there, you're just unlocking gates, and then they open, and you find more information relevant to your story and to your character.
And the book has plenty of connections, too. I mean, it's funny because one of the conclusions I made when reading the book is the amount of connections there. And I started thinking to myself, well, you had a smaller handful of families at that time and a smaller amount of church congregations, which were kind of the power base at that time. And those lent themselves to kind of natural connections, like you said?
Yes, it's a good point. I mean, Avon starts off with maybe just a little under 1,000 people during the first story of my book, 1817, and then grows to still only about 2,000 in the 1930s, which is the time period where my book comes to an end. So maybe it's not so surprising that there would be as many connections as you'd think, but I was nonetheless pretty surprised. I mean, you have characters like David Bartlett and Sherman Eddy who show up in multiple stories. Joe Alsop in multiple stories of the book, and sometimes in Chester Woodford, like you didn't expect them. Like, whoa, I didn't expect them to be here.
I didn't expect them. Yeah. What makes you suited to write narrative nonfiction?
Well, yeah, I think I maybe alluded to earlier. Even though I was a finance executive at the Hartford, so you have to have some big picture, broad thinking skills to do that kind of job. Given the position I had, that I also had to be, detailed and thorough, which are characteristics people have always attributed with me. So if you're someone who loves history, if you're someone who likes to write, and you're detail oriented, being a historian and writing about it is a good fit. It really it checks all the boxes, and I just have so much fun. I'm working on another project right now, so it's just really enjoyable for me to do the research.
Elaborate on the project you're working on right now.
Yeah, so right now, the past 4 months, I've been looking into the history of the Farmington Canal. And while there's a lot out there that's been written factually about what took place at that time, there really isn't a narrative story that gets into who are the prime players, what conflicts arose, how did they resolve those conflicts. And it turns out with the Farmington Canal, it's a fascinating story. There's lots of dissension and disagreement, particularly a rivalry between Hartford and New Haven that comes through that story. So I've been enjoying that one now.
Because I grew up in the Farmington Valley. I grew up in Simsbury. I've lived in Avon for the last 30 years. And you see these streets, references to canals, and I had never seen it. I kind of stumbled upon it on a hike one day. I'm like, wow, there actually was a canal. And there's parts that are still intact. I'm interested in reading that when that is released.
Yeah, it is interesting.
How did you choose the cover?
Yeah, so the cover of the book, came about as, I was taking a look at the options that I had. And I would say that the book itself, there are a number of stories. You cut across 100 years. It's really the lives of Avon residents and how they lived American history for that 100-year time frame. So that's an awful lot of topics. It's hard to find one image that would capture that. But as it turns out, as we talked about earlier, there's a whole section on the towers of Avon. The whole genesis of this book was me doing my trail work on the mountain. the view, which is depicted here in Thomas Cole's view of Montevideo, the seat of Daniel Wadsworth, is basically the view I see when I'm up there on the mountain. It is a picture of Avon looking south on the Talcott Mountain Ridge. And it's just a beautiful painting, and I just thought was perfect for the cover.
Where is that painting exhibited? Do you know? Or?
Yes, this painting is exhibited at the Wadsworth Athenaeum.
Okay, all right. Why did you choose the subtitle "Visionaries and Victims"?
Yes, so again, trying to find one theme that captures 100 years of stories is not that easy. But there are a number of characters in the book that were clearly ahead of their time. They challenged the norms, the conventions of their day. And so I thought that is a theme that you see throughout. And then, of course, victims, as other towns experience, Avon's had its share of tragedies, both murders and accidents. So I thought it was important to kind of capture the fact that there was really both elements that really come through the 100-year history of Avon.
Yeah, the story about the Climax Fuse disaster.
Yes.
It's funny because I would think of Avon being essentially rural and agricultural, and that they had already flipped a switch and gone into kind of a more industrial kind of base by that time, wouldn't you say?
They started to. Yeah, I mean, it's never been a huge industrial town. It was agrarian, really, up almost probably to the mid 20th century. But that was an important event because around the turn of the 20th century, from the late 1800s to the early 1900s, the Climax Fuse factory was the largest employer in town. We don't think of Avon as being a traditional mill town, but in fact, that fuse factory was essentially a mill. They dammed Nod Brook, which created a bit of a pond at that point near the sort of the present-day Farmington Valley Arts Village there. And the power from the water over the dam powered machinery that was used in the production of safety fuse at that plant. So that was a really important moment in, I would say, in the town's history. If you look at Climax Fuse in the center of town, and then also the fact that there were many residents of Huckleberry Hill who worked at the Collins factory in Collinsville, which is also discussed in the book. And that industrialization, of course, brings a new dynamic. Now we have immigrant families coming in. We have Italian, we have Irish, we have Central European, all coming to work at both of those plants. And changes the dynamic of the town.
You cover some grim stories in the book, war, murders, catastrophes. Tell me why you decided to include those.
Yeah, we'll see if how they're received. I mean, I wasn't just going to include, quote, any old murder. I mean, if somebody murders their wife or any old accident, I mean, if someone has an accident with their circular saw, that's not reason to put it in a book. But if somebody has an accident with their circular saw on a day that when each of the 3 nights previously they had a premonition of having an accident with their saw, well, now you have
now
a
we're
story.
onto something, right?
Now we're onto something. So in each of the cases of the murders and the accidents, there's a special dynamic to a reason why it was particularly newsworthy and makes a good story. So, and I thought in particular for the Climax Fuse factory, that was a really hard story to write. I mean, it's almost as though someone, being asked to write a story about how the people in the World Trade Center died on September 11th. I mean, it's just horrific. And so it was difficult to get into as a researcher and writer, but yet I think was able to add quite a bit to it to try to draw out who were these people, because these were this was the side of the community that was sort of under the radar. I mean, these are the poorest of the poor in town. They don't have a special identity as longtime town residents. They're immigrants or children of immigrants, and it was finding a way to tell their story because, of course, they're the ones that end up suffering the most from the factory fire.
It seems in that period of time in history too. In 2025, or maybe the late part of the 20th century, there was a development of responsibility and liability with disasters like that, and in that period of time, responsibility was rather open-ended, or maybe executives would shrug as it was an accident.
Yeah, I think so. At the time of the fire, whereas Climax Fuse started off as an independent company, but the time of the fire, it's controlled by Ensign Bickford in Simsbury, which has its own plant in Simsbury, which had its own history of a horrific fire. But there was no such thing as OSHA in those days, so as people who read the book will see, it was not a safe environment to work in at all. I mean, they did make some efforts at safety. They tried to install a sprinkler system, for example, but it was rudimentary, and it was an inherently very dangerous manufacturing process. And the result, unfortunately, was the loss of life.
Who were your favorite characters from Avon's first century?
Yeah, I would say my two most favorite characters would be David Bartlett, who was an abolitionist, and then later in the early part of the 20th century, Sherman Eddy, who was a horticulturalist. So they're very different individuals, of course, but David Bartlett was extraordinarily brave. I say that because as a young adult, only like 20, 21 years old, he goes up against the institution, which is the church. Because in his church, one of its members is an enslaver, a person by the name of Shubael Tillotson. Shubael, although he's from Avon and still maintains a home in Avon in the summers, he is a Louisiana sugar plantation owner. He has over 100 slaves. And that was absolutely unacceptable to many people who were members of the church that were following the gospel to love your neighbor as yourself, and to respect the dignity of every human being. And David, took offense to his church's position. Their position basically being, well, we're not going to judge the enslaver. We are going to allow the enslaver to stay as a member. So David says, I want out. I want to withdraw my membership. And when he does so, the church refuses to allow him to withdraw, if you can believe that. But he stands up for himself. And he, as a result, I don't want to give up too much of the story, but he suffers the consequence of that. But he goes on from there, and he really serves the cause of abolition through his writing. He is a correspondent, and then later in life also serves the underprivileged in another story that comes up with a book related to Young Wing. So he's just an admirable character. In fact, I think he's so important, really, to the town's history. It's almost you could have a statue of him in town. To me, he's that important. And then Sherman Eddy, I mentioned, he ends up after the Climax Fuse Factory fire. About a year later, he takes the job there as superintendent of the factory floor in Avon. And he goes on to raise a family, but his true love is in horticulture and growing food and plants, and he ends up being a big proponent of native plants. He develops ornate gardens for a lot of wealthy residents in the Hartford area. He opens a business and does that, but he has the foresight to see that the introduction of non-native species is going to cause great harm on our environment. So he's an early promoter of native species.
And that's him on the back of the book?
Yeah, that's right. The back cover of the book has a picture of him and his first wife, Grace, and their two sons in the back were hidden, but if you look closer, you can see them. But it's a beautiful picture in his 1915 era automobile with all these different plants and flowers decorated for the 4th of July.
It's a really well put together package.
Yeah, thanks.
What's the most fun story of the book?
I think what people find is the most fun story of the book is one called The Shady Side of Ministry. And it's a story about a regrettable decision that the Avon congregational minister named Stephen Hubble and his wife Martha make in the spring of 1853. And that regrettable decision has to do with complaining about the inadequate remuneration of Mr. Hubble's minister. But I won't spoil much from that, but it's just rather humorous, both tragic and humorous, I guess you could say, at the same time, as to what takes place in the town when they find out that the Hubbles have said some not so nice things about town residents.
It was a bit of a kind of a soap opera kind of story.
It is a bit of a soap opera, yes.
Did you research any other stories that didn't make it into the book?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's difficult because there's a lot of things you want to put in the book and it may not have room for. The one in particular, I would say, was another Civil War era story about a soldier named Eugene Hawley. I already had a lot in there about the Civil War, so I figured it was just a little bit too much, too heavy to include that. I may publish, though, separately at some point, a story about Eugene Hawley. He's a dear character. I say dear. He joins, with his parents' permission, as a 17-year-old. He enlists in the 5th Connecticut Company Regiment. And he goes through just an unbelievable hardships, in prison twice. But what's really special about him are his letters back and forth to his parents, because it shows this swing in emotions from this bravado and elation at the start of the war, and then going way to the lowest of the lowest, and then just regaining that bravado as he approaches the next battle. It's just this swinging back and forth of emotions that I think is just so precious and captures sort of the sentiment, the mood of many in the country, and certainly of the Union soldiers during the war.
And so painfully young.
Yes.
I'd like you to maybe read a favorite passage from the book. There's so much in this collection that if Scott would take a moment and read a short passage.
Sure, yeah, I could do that. Let me just take a look at one here for, I think maybe the shady side of ministry, actually. Maybe if I could just start with that one. Just here's the opening to it. Decidedly bitter, Reverend Stephen Hubble of the Avon Congregational Church addressed his congregation for the last time on June 26, 1853. He had poured his heart and soul into being the best minister he could, tirelessly attending to the sick and presiding over countless weddings, funerals, and baptisms, while still finding time to prepare sermons. He knew as a Christian he needed to be charitable and kind, but inside he was seething at how he had been treated and could keep it in no longer. Finally, acknowledging what all had suspected, Stephen admitted his true feelings. There have been seasons when I had little heart or relish for converse with my people, times of disquietude and sorrowful perplexity, when the stinted income allowed showed its insufficiency in the face of semi-annual bills that must be met to save my credit from dishonor. Wanting to make sure his parishioners knew exactly who was to blame for their circumstances, Stephen got more pointed, asserting that he had staggered on, impoverishing myself and ministering to a people abundantly able to place their pastor above pecuniary solitude. And he didn't stop there. He implored his congregation to repent for their sins against him, and the sooner they got to it, the better. Some of you are far down in life's declivity, your locks whitening for the tomb, and your sun sinking to the very verge of the western hills. How did it all come to this? What began as whispers among his parishioners would quickly turn into a firestorm of controversy that would result in a hearing by the ecclesiastical council. This is not how a minister should be treated. Toward the end of his valedictory sermon, Stephen Hubble asked his congregation if making a point of his insufficient salary was really such a scandal and a crime. Perhaps not, but in this case, it was a bit shady.
Yeah, that's remarkable. Yeah, it's one thing, and I think I kind of quite often forget about it, but the political power, and I mean that in the most obvious way, that the political power of ministers in that time, especially in New England in that period, was formidable.
Yes, it was. You had the history of the church, of course, that as indicated in the first story in the book about the Lord's barn, So in the state of Connecticut, the church and the state were one. So, separation of church and state has kind of come up more recently in our news. But back then in the state of Connecticut, they were literally one and the same. You paid your taxes to the church. And that was true up until Connecticut changed its constitution in 1818. But nonetheless, even after that, in the time of Stephen Hubble, most people in the community, were expected to attend church. And, in fact, they attended multiple services on Sundays. There would be a morning and an afternoon service. So, and they looked up to their minister without a doubt.
And it seems like in those days, the book kind of shows that if you were either in or out with the church, and it was unacceptable with the churches in Avon to be out.
Yes, I think if you're alluding to whether people felt pressure to be a member of the church, certainly if you were baptized into the church, grew up as a member, and then committed some infraction. When I say infraction, that could be something as simple as not attending church service. That would subject you to potential excommunication, which in that day and age really ostracized you from the community. You were looked down upon.
It was a religious and a social
Yeah,
move.
it was religious and social. You were really an outcast at that point, which is why, to my point earlier about David Bartlett, it was so courageous of him to take the stand that he did.
What surprised you the most about the people of the Avon's first century?
Well, I would say their resourcefulness. It was an era where people were self-reliant. You grew your own food, for example, but also you had to figure things out yourself on the farm, how to fix things. And as a result, I think people thought for themselves, and they were more likely perhaps to challenge conventions and to be innovative. So I think you see that come through the book.
If you had to, I'm going to put you on the spot for a second, Scott.
Yeah.
If you had to pick an event that defined Avon's early character, what might it be?
Yeah, it's hard to pick one moment that would define its character. I think certainly as the whole nation grappled with slavery and abolition and the Civil War, that era tested citizens, because all across America there was this division. So I would say it tested the character of the citizens at that time. Certainly as you get to the turn of the century with industrialization, that becomes an important event, because now we bring in a whole new, different background of people into the mix. So I think both are important in the town's history.
That's a really remarkable thing I felt when reading the book is sometimes it's easy to separate national history from local history. And even within Avon, growing up in the North, I was educated in the 80s. So much of, or all of that history had already happened. And
Yep.
somewhat arrogantly, the North were the good guys, the South were the bad guys, and the good guys won. It was a very moralistic rolling out of the Civil War.
Yes.
But really, like locally, the arguments within the churches were more nuanced than that. There were plenty of people that were pro-slavery, at the very least, indifferent about it. They maybe accepted it as a necessary evil, you think?
There were. So what happens is, as the stories in this section on slavery, abolition, and the Civil War all do, and they all kind of weave together those four stories, but the theme that you see through there is this division that happens within the membership of really a number of churches. The congregational churches, of course, were the church at that time in all the towns, particularly Farmington and Avon, where the membership is about evenly divided. And it results into very contentious church meetings about what to do, whether enslavers should ever be admitted as members. Can you denounce slavery and yet embrace the slaveholder?
Which is clearly shown in the book, too. There's
Yes.
a particular story about that.
Right.
What advice would you give to somebody who wants to research your town's history?
Well, I think certainly the place you'd want to start is either your historical society or your library, which is likely to have gathered some materials about about the town's history, and it's really a great thanks to all the families who lived in town over generations who saved documents, letters, diaries, journals, etc., and have provided them so that they can be researched today. So that's where I would say to start, and then from there you just start to peel back the onion and you follow wherever leads take you.
How much of Avon's history would you say is about ordinary people versus prominent figures? And you have several levels of prominent figures, and I would say several levels of ordinary people too.
Yes, that's right. I would say, overwhelmingly, the book is about ordinary people. There are a couple of more prominent folks from the era. So certainly Daniel Wadsworth was a prominent citizen of Hartford who builds Montevideo, and then Theodate Pope Riddle, who builds the Avon Old Farm School. But generally, pretty much all the other primary characters in the book are not famous. They're not prominent. A couple of them interact with some very prominent people, however. So those make the stories.
For listeners who want to learn more, where is your book available, Scott?
Yes, it's available online at arcadiapublishing.com or at amazon.com or barnesandnoble.com. It's also available in person here at the Avon History Museum. There's a supply of books that people can buy if they want to come in. And also local Barnes and Noble stores in the area are also carrying. Yeah.
How did a religion or community institution shape Avon's early years? We touched on that a bit.
We did, yeah. So what happens is, I mentioned this, we had a lack of separation. We had church and state were the same, essentially, up until 1818 in Connecticut. So everything went through the church. So you were going to be a member because your voice, that was your participation in society, was through your church membership, essentially. And that's the case all the way up until 1818. But then even past, and of course, people are religious. There's a whole era where we go through something called the Second Great Awakening in the 1820s, where there's a religious revival of which Wilford Woodruff is part of. And then you have the whole temperance movement. Lyman Beecher from Connecticut, so Stephen Hubble, for example, is a minister that we just talked about earlier. He embraces that movement. So there's different revivals of religious fervor at times in our history, and that comes through the book as well.
It's funny, one impression I got too at the time they were Protestant churches, but the schisms of certain churches at the time, and sometimes because of political means, and sometimes it sounds like just inconvenience in some ways. Really, Avon was not quite as passable in those days. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so many towns across Connecticut ended up with two spires, if you will, instead of one. And that's because really the distance to travel to church on Sunday, particularly in winter, was too much. So, for example, the Northington Parish, the northern section of Farmington, if you will, what became Avon, it's separated from Farmington in the 1750s over the issue of the fact that it was just too far to drive from, say, the intersection of present-day Old Farms Road and Waterfill Road to get yourself by wagon down to the center of Farmington. It's only a couple of miles, but it's just too far to go. So they said, we want to have our own parish. The same thing happens in the early 1800s, where now within the Northington Parish, we have this separation between East Avon, those living east of the river or near present-day downtown, the village of Avon, as one section of town versus those living in West Avon, including what we think of today as West Avon, Lovely Street, Huckleberry Hill. So that separation causes major confrontation that results in the incendiary developments that happen in the first story of my book.
Do you know what the main, say in the 19th century going into the early 20th century, what were the main thoroughfares in Avon that were outside of the technology with carriages or horses, what the main thoroughfares were in Avon at that time?
Yeah, certainly around 1798, the Albany Turnpike opens. So it's hard to think of it in terms of modern day age. I mean, they did the best they could, but it was still a very ruddy, muddy, rocky road to try to get yourself from West Hartford, all the way up over the mountain to Avon.
People were doing that, though.
People were doing that as early as that, but it was an arduous journey. Benjamin Silliman, a Yale professor at the time, talks about that journey of being very difficult. So it sort of really hampered the development of Avon. It was farmers or quarries in the northwest part of the state. It was hard for them even to get their goods over the mountain. But the Albany Turnpike is an important development in the town's history because when the Farmington Canal opens in 1828, now the intersection of the canal running north and south near sort of present-day Old Farms Road, Simsbury Road, with Route 44, Albany Turnpike, that becomes an important transportation depot. We built a canal warehouse, and it's really that event more than anything else that triggers the separation of what's then is known as Northington from Farmington, and the town is incorporated in 1830, 2 years later, as Avon. And it's an important depot on the canal, shipping goods to New Haven from all places really out in Litchfield County.
What was the site of the canal warehouse?
So the canal warehouse, it was, I'm going to say, roughly speaking, maybe just east of the present-day DeCapo restaurant, so close to the intersection of Old Farms Road and Main Street, but just south of it.
And that was essentially like a depot where merchants stored goods that were shipped on the canal.
That's exactly right. Yes. I think people will enjoy the book. I really appreciate the time. I think, I think in particular, this section on slavery abolition and the Civil War is particularly compelling. Those stories are really good. But I love, of course, I love all the stories of the towers of Avon, as we talked about, as well as some of the calamities, and just some really interesting characters. I thoroughly enjoyed doing the research and sharing it with the public, and I hope people enjoy it.
Well, it's an ambitious project, and I commend you, and I'm looking forward to your future works. I think it would be well worth folks to track Avon's first century Visionaries and Victims down by author Scott Lewis. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you, Jim.
That was Scott Lewis, author of Avon's First Century, Visionaries and Victims, a remarkable look at Avon's first 100 years and the people who built its identity through vision, struggle, and perseverance. If you'd like to learn more, Visionaries and Victims is available at Avon History Museum, ArcadiaPublishing.com, Amazon.com, and BarnesandNoble.com. Special thanks to Scott for sharing your time and insight with us today, and thanks to all of you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode of Avon Talks, please follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcast and share with a friend who loves history as much as we do. Until next time, I'm Jim Pabich. This has been Avon Talks, where we bring Avon's history home one story at a time.